Uh, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Aubrey Blanche as one of the speakers at VC++ 2020. Aubrey, can you tell the audience about yourself?
Yeah, so first, thank you so much. I'm really, really excited to get to join you. So my background is a little bit varied, but if you think about what I focus on, it's really on creating equity and therefore diversity across the sort of tech, VC, and financial sectors. So my day job, I'm the director of Equitable Design at Culture Amp, which is a Series E VC-backed startup that is a people and culture platform. I'm also an angel and an LP. And then I'm also a consultant. So as a consultant, I work with organizations to transform their cultures to be the meritocracies they seem to believe that they are. And then also sort of my technical specialty is really in looking at AI and machine learning and thinking about ways to build or apply those in ways that create fairness or equity in the world, because what we see is a lot of the algorithms that are developed actually re-entrench systemic discrimination and exclusion.
Weapons of Math Destruction, if you read
Yes.
that book, is
Yes.
fantastic. So let's jump right into the elephant in the room, which is the structural biases of the startup ecosystem and what they look like and what people that seek to change that can do to affect change.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different I'll talk about a couple of like philosophical beliefs that exist there and then like how they show up. So I think the first one is this like belief in meritocracy, generally speaking. And the fact is the whole belief is bullshit. Venture capital is not a meritocracy. In fact, there's data that shows that VCs make really biased decisions that actually they should be sued for, right? Because they're not maximizing their returns
Right.
for their keys. Um, and also I think we need to contend with the fact that there are actually like openly exclusive ideologies that are quite prevalent in tech and VC. So frankly, like the tech ecosystem is really white supremacist. And I mean
Mhm.
that both in like the implicit ways it shows up in like their actual open white supremacists running major VC funds.
Right.
And so like I think we need to name that. But how I think that shows up often is it's rarely explicit in like we want to exclude XYZ. But what you see is these are really closed networks. So 91% of venture partners are white or Asian men. Um, and one of the most important, like two biggest things that I think that hurts is one, because this is such a network based um, industry, basically, if you aren't already rich and connected, you don't get to talk to VCs.
Right.
And because we know about, right, so the historical exclusion that's happened, what you're talking about is if you're Black, brown, queer, a woman, you're not even going to get the intro. And then the second piece is, frankly, just those venture partners aren't actually qualified to invest in a broad set of businesses. So there was a story that really brought this to light for me from a company called Lola, which started out making tampons sort of with cleaner manufacturing. And the questions that she got about menstruation and like vaginas
Sure.
were like high school biology 101 level questions.
Furry bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah, just like and most of these
Yeah.
men we assume are like reasonably straight. And it's like, how are you functional in society at this level without knowing how this works? And
Right.
so not to like insult those people, but at the same time, like how could she possibly get a fair investment look if the
Mhm.
people in the room don't even understand the basic problem she's solving, let alone why what she was solving was something there was a huge market opportunity for.
Sure.
And
And
so
we've seen femtech really gets funded first by funds that have female partners, and there's at least people that get it in the room at some level.
exactly. And we also like venture capitalists on average are like reasonably rich. And so they like
Mhm.
fund things that solve rich people problems.
Right.
I know we pick on Juicero, but like, what was that?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I say that as someone who like has 4 food delivery apps on my phone.
Right.
Um, but I think that's it, is that what we see is both that it's actively discriminatory and that like people can't get meetings, but also like the very limited perspective on the world and cognitive models that VCs have by
Mhm.
virtue of a very limited set of life experiences means that they're not actually funding incredible innovative businesses.
Yep.
At the level that they should, which is both like bad for returns, if that's sort of your justification, but it's also just really bad for humanity.
Right. So I think there's a narrowness of focus in who they talk to and the businesses they look at on the one side, and then a substantial body of peer-reviewed stuff about the nature of group decision making on the other side. If you're really making high-risk decisions, the value of looking at it from multiple perspectives goes up a lot because the blind spots are what result in portfolio failures, in my view.
Totally. And for folks, I think Scott Page's work is especially compelling on this. So he's a professor of complex systems at Michigan.
Mhm.
I think one of the other ways that VCs like unintentionally gatekeep, maybe intentionally, I just had this conversation with an MP last week, which is this person said, "Oh, we only talk to founders of growth stage businesses."
Mhm.
And I said, "Well, because of the discrimination at seed and Series A, you're basically saying I only talk to white men.
Right.
Take the
Right.
meeting."
No, we have, sorry, just we have a couple of folks really looking at the, if you need to do a friends, family, and fools round, and all your friends are poor and your family's poor, what does that mean? Because the traditional venture ecosystem is, well, first you ask the rich dude for your first 100, and then that's on the, trust me, I went to prep school.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And so I've never raised funding. My business is just a consultancy, but I can tell
Mhm.
you that I was told to my face in my first tech job that the reason I got a phone screen was because I went to Stanford.
Right, right.
And I both knew I needed to go to Stanford for those reasons and was also like deeply upset about it because as someone who's been there, none of the smartest people I know have gone to a top 25 school.
Yeah, and
Um,
and I think just to expand on that point, the if you look at the way that I think of it is the venture Ivy plus, which is if you take the Ivy League and then do Stanford and Berkeley, um, the venture fund community is incredibly over-indexed for those schools. So it's the majority of partners, and that's a tiny, tiny sliver of the global population. So, I live in Princeton, and I'm not mean to people from Princeton, but they're not the people that I'm really going out of my way to say, you've been challenged by systemic inequities and I'm here to help you. It's like, you've got plenty of help.
Yeah. And I think there's one particular thing that always like amazes me, which is
Mhm.
venture investors at minimum, even if they haven't run their own startup, which fun fact, I think it was Charles Hudson who did this research at Precursor. But basically it's like if you're not a white man, you have to have like had a successful exit to like get into VC. And if
Right.
you're a white man, you just have to be Michael Moritz.
The successful exit occurred at birth, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah. That's amazing. But the thing for me is we know that building a startup at the pace that like venture sort of incentivizes takes like an amount of creativity and grit and all of these skills that I'm like, if we were rational, we would be over indexing on underrepresented people who have already proven by virtue of their existence standing in that room that
Absolutely.
they have what it takes. So not to, again, as someone who has like went to quote elite schools because I knew that I needed to.
Sure.
But I think that that's one thing is like for me, if I'm being rational, I have a much higher bar for people who have like traditional educations to like prove to me that they're doing something interesting and new.
Yes. Yes.
And I think I would like to think my investments have been pretty good, but like I think that's it is when you look at it rationally, you go, oh, if someone has had to hustle to get here, like you've shown me by virtue of the fact that you're pitching me.
Right. So let's talk about that both as an LP
Yeah.
and as a direct investor. How
Mhm.
does that inform your decision, and what kind of conversation does that lead to your co-investors, right? Do you naturally then gravitate to co-investors that agree with that thesis, or is it, how does that play through?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, for example, I'm an LP in Operator Collective. So if you're
Yeah.
not familiar, Malin and Layla lead that fund, and it's a whole different model. So we got brought in as LPs because we were operators, and
Right.
because what Malin saw was both that a lot of us who are underrepresented don't want to be fund managers, right? We want to invest, but we don't want to be fund managers.
Sure.
We actually want to build and create. And so for me, with that, it was someone who had a different vision, right? That was the reason. But also for me, it was important that I brought in more Black, Latinx folks into
Mhm.
BLPs.
Right.
So I'm a Latina woman myself, queer Latina woman. So I'm like a unicorn in
Yep.
VC. And so for me, getting that access is both about like, I want to work with fund managers who think differently on
Yep.
the LP side. And I have a commitment out. I won't talk about it now since we haven't closed everything, but
That's
I'm fully in.
right.
And it was somebody who is outside of Silicon Valley, is explicitly investing outside of Silicon Valley, has a totally new support model than I've ever seen for a fund of that size. And even just taking a peek at his background, hustled a couple of startups through, two that failed, one that had a good exit. And within 10 minutes, him just talking through the deliberateness with which everything was structured and
Right.
looking what he was focused on based on what was clearly his professional and lived experience. I was like, yeah, of course I believe you that you can do this.
So,
And that is what I see that tends to be different than these sort of traditional fund managers is they show me their logos,
yeah.
not their path. And
Yeah.
so for me, my questions around is either, do you have an entirely new vision of how to do something? Like, I don't just want to,
Right.
no offense to like a benchmark or whatever, but that's been done. I want to play a different game.
Right.
Or I'm like, show me what you've overcome, because all I know when I give you this money is you're going to hit 50 hurdles that you haven't anticipated.
Absolutely. So resilience under adversity
Yeah.
is huge. Um, yeah, that's really interesting. So if I given that you're out deploying dollars and looking for uh, entrepreneurs that don't come from the traditional pools, right?
Mhm.
What do you do to help them find you? Because a big part of uh, leveling the playing field, and I think it's an interesting time because now most funds have done an all Zoom investment.
Mhm.
So it's not like you have to assault people in the Starbucks line in Sand Hill Road, right? You have to do some other path in. But what's your advice to founders that didn't have a college roommate that went to a hedge fund or a venture fund and are trying to seek capital?
Yeah, so I think networking is also still important. For me
Yep.
as an investor, my website has a contact form for me. And I take that really seriously, much to my detriment. I get back to most emails that get sent to me. So I think that's part of it. I'm open on my LinkedIn and my Twitter, and I have a pretty reasonable social following. I say that I'm an investor. People know that I focus on underrepresented people. But I think I've also spent the last however long I've been in tech, intentionally networking with people who have
Mhm.
access to those networks. So I make it a point when I meet, like a Black founder, I'm like, hey, by the way, always happy to have intros, even if I'm not an investor, happy to make intros on behalf. And
So
I'm very explicit about that.
I'll say to the audience that first of all, I highly recommend following Aubrey on Twitter. It's one of the delights of my day. And second, that it is a way to network in. There is a meaningful and active community of people that are rethinking the pathways into the conversation about I have an early stage company, look at me. And not every door is open, but even in traditional venture, you pitch 100 times, one person likes you. That's the numbers game. So you need persistence, but there are people there that will have that conversation.
Yeah, and I'm also really, and this is another reason that I'm sort of affiliated with Operator Collective, is because
Mhm.
Malin had the same vision, which is she's like, I have a really deep network.
Yep.
Even if it's off our thesis, if we don't want to give money, we know people, we can give access that
Right.
way. And so that's a lot of what I do. Sometimes, I always say, send me a deck first and I'll look at it. I'm like, I know nothing about this business. Like, I'm not even going to give you 30 minutes because I can't be useful, but give me an idea of who you are looking for. And
Right.
if I know someone, I'm like, let me pass that along. And so that's the other thing is I see a lot of the value that I provide in venture. Less there's certain like enterprise SaaS I know, like
Sure,
culture and talent, especially in go to market, like I can
sure,
help out with. Product accessibility, I know how to pitch to those groups. So that's I try to invest. I personally invest in businesses where I really understand the business model and I think I can be uniquely valuable. But then even for businesses run by underrepresented founders or fund managers, I'm aggressive with my network, and that's the value I can provide. So oftentimes, I don't have financial benefit coming to me
sure,
from that.
sure.
But over time, what I found is that it actually ends up coming back, right? Because like a third degree person said, "Oh, Aubrey helped me out this one time," and this person has a business. And I can't tell you the number of cap tables like I've gotten on where I'm like, "Hey, I don't have much liquidity right now. I'm not really writing checks."
Yeah,
And, like they'll drop the minimum for me,
sure, sure.
things like that.
Absolutely.
So
No, there are people out there. So let me ask another question. This is really to help first time founders in the
yeah,
room, right? So part of it is, hey, have the courage to reach out to someone like you. Another part of it is I'll call it venture literacy, right? How do you prepare yourself so that if I crack the code and get a meeting with you or one of your peers that's uh, investing or considering investing in this kind of space and is happy to help, what do I do to make sure that I'm grounded in that conversation and uh, I'm not saying what's a cap table, what's a safe, what's a,
yeah, that's a great question. So I would say there's a lot of people out there who are publishing like how to do this well. One person who's a friend, but also I really respect is Terrell Sterling, leads an organization called Paladin. And his goal is really to democratize access to entrepreneurship.
yeah,
And Paladin curates incredible resources. I think Lolita Taub on Twitter does a lot
yeah,
to help founders and just curating those resources. I would say follow the investors on Twitter or LinkedIn.
yep,
Go check out all of the free resources on Y Combinator. So I also, God, what's it called? The book Venture Deals.
okay,
I really, it was something I read. It's my copy's all busted now.
mhm,
I think it's more useful for later stage funds when you actually have
right,
metrics.
right,
But I would say do that. Go read that stuff and self educate. I also would just be really honest. I've been really impressed where some founders have emailed and said, "Can I have an intro? And what are the things that are most important for you to know?"
hmm,
So I think it's okay to ask because investors are all different and trying to like magically triangulate like their preferences and what they want to know. I
sure,
really only invest in like very early stage. So I'm like, what metrics do you have? Like the folks
right,
that I invest in
right.
is
It's
don't
just
have that.
whatever drugs you want to smoke, and
And
yeah,
so I think that's it is I think it's okay to ask investors like what do you look for? And quite frankly, if someone is a jerk to you or looks down to you on that, then they just lost a great deal.
right. Right. Interesting. So let's talk about metrics. If you are advising a founder, what kinds of things should they be instrumenting to think about inclusion and holding themselves accountable for being a place that fosters inclusion?
Yeah, so I think first, write down your values really, really, really early.
Yeah.
Like I am bringing on my first business manager, so like my
Mhm.
integrator to
Yeah.
my business, and the core values V1 are already done.
Yeah.
So before I even had employees, so you need to have values, and those values need to be pro-social.
Yeah.
So companies that say like we do nothing but focus on our mission, and we don't do anything outside of that you're not going to be able to hire a diverse group of people
Mhm.
because a diverse group of people has a diverse set of needs and issues that impact them in the workplace. I would go look, go take a look at guides like what Project Include put out. It's 87 suggestions, all of which are great. The number one metric I would coach underrepresented founders on what percentage of your networking time is outside of traditional white, male, Asian VC networks? What percentage of your total network time are you actually growing your network into those upper represented communities? Because that's going to, when you come to me and you're 10 people and you go, oh, but I care about diversity, how do I hire? well, now I have to spend time growing you a professional network so people might want to work with you.
Mhm.
So I think that's the number one early stage founder thing. And we all know that everybody's networking anyway. So I'm not adding work. I'm asking you to not just talk to the people who are already well connected, but
Sure.
how can you as a founder become that bridge? Because ultimately you're going to get access to better mental models, ideas, market understandings, and talent over the long term.
It's a great point, and I've had several speakers for this conference talk about, one, going outside, let's say your network of comfort, both on a business and a personal basis, and two, really looking yourself in the mirror and saying, whatever I'm talking about in my startup role, what does my personal network look like? Because at some level, that is putting your money where your mouth is, or voting with your feet, or whatever you want to call it. That if you have this extremely homogeneous network in your social circle, that's your comfort zone, and challenge yourself on that. So I don't know what your take on that is, but
I think it's totally right. I think that, and the other thing I would say is like networking. When you start to network outside of where your network of comfort, as you called it, like be
Mhm.
an observer at first.
Yeah,
Right? Assume that you don't know a bunch of stuff. You won't know what that is, and I won't be able to tell you because I don't know what community you're thinking about. But like,
sure,
just assume you don't know a lot of stuff.
sure,
It turns out one that's actually a really great motto for life.
yeah,
But I think that's it is even things like community norms, how people prefer to be connected. Like one of the things that I have had to learn is like how transactional a lot of relationships in like tech and on the West Coast are, and that can be
mhm,
really jarring. I would say, speaking for communities of color, I was raised in a mixed household, but that's one of the number one things I hear from people of color is like they're just not who move into VC. As often communities of color are much more communal and sociocentric. And so
mhm,
learning that it's okay to be transactional is something that's actually quite strange. And so the way you show up in those networks and communities might need to be different.
yeah,
And so slow down and observe. The second sort of piece of advice I would give for you as you're expanding those networks is give first,
totally.
right? Just like provide something of value. Don't expect to get anything back for it. It'll come back eventually. I promise. That's how energy in the universe works. But that's been one of the things that I think has both helped me as an investor, but also as sort of an operator and an executive, even building out sort of DEI programs in companies
I
is
want
often
Yeah, I
your
want to
first.
jump in and
Yeah.
amplify that. So, Startup Grind is a partner in this whole event, and I'm a Startup Grind chapter director. And one of the three core values of Startup Grind is give first, and it really does work. It really, and I think it not only works on a business level, but I find that mindset makes me have much happier days. When you sit down with someone and you're really thinking about how can I help you, you get to a different mental space than I need to have the transactional scale balance every time I sharpen a pencil. Uh, so anyway,
Yeah. So yeah, that's exactly it. And I think what's really important about that is that you're giving without like this expectation of like direct return, right? Like
Mhm.
it doesn't actually work if you're expecting anything. So yeah, I think that's it where you just have to give because you want to, because you have something valuable and you want to share it. That's where it comes back really, really well. And I would say rarely does what I offer come directly back from the same person, right? It's that thing where like I get a tip about an investment, through the network, or someone says, hey, or I put out a call and suddenly like I have a great person to hire for a role that I was looking for, and it was because someone said, oh, she's a reasonable human and like she's safe to work with.
Right,
um, and so
right.
I think that's it is trust. It'll come back, but it's usually not direct.
So let's talk just a little bit about uh, leadership and what, as a leader, uh, one should look to do to really drive inclusion. How do you send those signals? What's your advice for people that uh, want to drive change in their organization, want to be a role model, what can they do that's most impactful?
Yeah, I would say first start educating yourself, and do some serious self-reflection. So if you're starting on your journey, ask yourself why you didn't care about other people before. And I know that's like a really rough question,
Yeah,
but I think this work takes a lot of, because this is not like I say I care about diversity. All I have to say to people to say I care about diversity, I say how much time, money have you put
yeah,
into it? Because nothing else
yeah.
counts. And so I think that's one is like do some really deep self-reflection about why it wasn't a priority enough for you to move on before, because that will tell you what your blockers was. Was it self-absorption? Maybe. Was it time and lack of prioritization? Could be. Was it lack of knowledge? Also important to know. And then I think understand that there is no stopping point on self-education for this. So that's like number one is like, for me, Twitter is like my tool.
Hmm.
So whenever I'm starting to say, oh, well, here's an area of the world I need to understand better, I go and I find all sorts of experts on Twitter because half my brain is basically a Twitter feed. And I follow them and I listen and I educate myself from like firsthand experiences. So whether that's podcasts or books for you or blogs, it doesn't matter. Find your way of learning. And that's really important. The second is always, always, always ask for feedback. So even though I'm supposed to be, I suppose, the most inclusive person at Culture Amp, I hope,
Sure.
is every quarter I send out like a feedback form. You could do it in Google Forms
Uh-huh.
to 20 to 25 people. And I ask them two questions. What's one thing I've done that's made you feel included or like you belong that I should continue? And what's something in the last quarter that I've done that's made you feel excluded or left out that I should be aware of and stop doing? And I tell them I'm sending this to 20 or 25 people. So your specificity is like, I'm grateful for it.
Right.
Um, I use Culture Amp now for
Right.
that.
Of
As a
course.
question. But that's it. Keep asking questions. And when you ask that question, send the report back out to folks. I just published like a little like one or
Yeah.
two paragraph thing. It's like, hey, here's what I heard. Because that builds trust over time. And what I've found is I don't get a ton of helpful feedback anonymously anymore
Mhm.
because people now give it to me like to my face.
But you've probably built trust to get to the
Because I
point where
built
they can say
trust. But
that.
at the beginning, that
Yeah.
anonymity is really powerful. But I think that's it. Reflect on why you haven't done whatever you haven't done. Um, take responsibility for it. Ask for feedback and dedicate yourself to learning.
Yeah, that's amazing. One of the things I find is that startups are often coached, and there's a lot of literature about you have to be ruthless about what your net promoter scores are and feedback from customers, and they apply that to their product, but not their culture. And holding culture to the same scrutiny and saying, we need a feedback loop, we need to be able to look ourselves in the mirror. If we can't have an open, candid discussion about our flaws, we will continue to fail, right? And but there's not that same process model that I think is widely embraced around this. This is a way for us to manage the conversation. Of course, we should instrument it. Of course, we should be intentional about it in the way that an MVP is treated. So I don't
Yeah,
know. Maybe we'll have a minimum viable culture someday, right?
yeah, and I think it's more just like minimum viable humanity in some
Yeah,
ways.
yeah,
Like, um, I think about like these startup founders that are like, no, we need to work 80, 100-hour weeks. And I'm like, I won't invest in founders that believe that because I know how the human nervous system works. And like, you're not getting better productivity. You're not getting better
right. No,
decisions.
I think
You're also being angry and sad. Like,
996 stuff
right?
is,
It's,
yeah.
and, and it's the same thing with, I'm not expecting everyone to be like an expert on inclusion off
Mhm.
the jump, but at the same time, if you as a leader come to me and you have like never thought about it and you have no plan, you're not a good leader, like full stop, because the people that you lead aren't only going to be people like you.
Right.
And so I think that's what it comes down to is I think we need to redefine, like so many people come and when we talk about EDI, they're like, oh, I don't want to lower the bar. I'm like, it is in the basement. What are you talking
Yeah.
about? And so
No,
about raising
one of the metaphors that Ilaria uses that I like a lot is if you went to an investment manager and you said, I only want to invest my entire portfolio in one class of securities, they'd tell you you're crazy. And yet we do that with people often. And to just say there's a lot of different things out there that we can. So anyway, I love it. If we define what we expect of a great leader is inclusion, and it's you need to embrace this and be intentional about it. That's awesome. Any last words for our audience here today?
Yes, we can talk about this more, or you can follow me on Twitter, but remember, it's not really unconscious bias. It's the conscious design decisions you make with your time in your company.
Love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.